The regret didn't arrive when they lost you. It arrived when they realized they couldn't outrun what you activated in them. Avoidants don't step into connections anticipating fallout because their entire attachment strategy is built on one quiet assumption: distance will always save them. From the beginning, they subconsciously believe that if things become too intense, too emotional, or too real, they can simply pull back and regulate themselves through separation. That belief is what allows them to engage at all. So when the connection starts, they aren't careless, they're confident in their escape route. What they don't anticipate is that some connections bypass logic and go straight to the nervous system. And when that happens, detachment no longer works the way it used to. The regret doesn't surface at the moment of the breakup because at that stage, avoidance still feels like relief. The nervous system experiences distance as safety. They distract, stay busy, appear composed, and convince themselves the situation is resolved. But avoidant regulation is delayed, not eliminated. Weeks or months later, when external stimulation quiets and the body no longer needs to defend itself, the emotional imprint resurfaces. That's when the regret begins, not as longing, but as destabilization. A subtle internal realization forms. That wasn't just a relationship. You didn't just represent companionship or chemistry. You represented emotional exposure at a depth they hadn't encountered before. You activated attachment circuitry they didn't know how to metabolize. And once activated, it doesn't simply shut off because the relationship ends. This is why the regret feels so foreign to them. It doesn't present as sadness or heartbreak, emotions they know how to suppress. It presents as unease, restlessness, and a quiet internal pressure they can't name without confronting something they've spent a lifetime avoiding. The regret threatens their self-concept. If they admit it mattered, then detachment wasn't strength, it was a limitation. If they admit it affected them, then they weren't as independent as they believed. So the feeling stays private, unspoken, and unresolved. They replay the situation not to romanticize it, but to understand why it still has weight, why certain moments linger, why comparisons start forming with people who came after you. This is the part they never planned for. Emotional activation without resolution. You became a marker in their system, evidence that avoidance doesn't erase impact, it only delays, and that delayed recognition is what creates regret. Not regret for the ending itself, but regret for underestimating the depth of what was happening while it was happening. By the time they understand it, the moment to show up has already passed. And that realization that something real slipped through their hands because they couldn't stay present long enough to recognize it is the regret they never wanted to feel and never wanted you to know existed. They didn't keep you in the dark to control you. They did it to survive themselves. Avoidants don't hide the truth because they enjoy secrecy or power. They hide it because truth creates emotional weight, and emotional weight feels dangerous to their nervous system. Revealing what they were actually feeling would have required emotional accountability, not just to you, but to themselves. It would have meant admitting confusion, attachment, fear, and intensity they didn't know how to regulate once spoken aloud. For an avoidant, naming an emotion doesn't relieve it, it amplifies it. The moment a feeling is acknowledged, it becomes real, trackable, and relational. And that is precisely what their system is designed to avoid. So instead of transparency, they choose containment. Inner conflict stays unspoken. Doubt stays buried. Attachment intensity gets diluted into mixed signals, emotional distance, or vague explanations that never quite tell the full story. This isn't manipulation, it's self-preservation. A quiet attempt to keep the bond from crossing the invisible line where it would require presence, consistency, and emotional follow-through. Because once they admit how much the situation matters, they lose their internal sense of control. They can no longer pretend they're unaffected or autonomous. They can no longer exit cleanly. Accountability turns the connection into something that asks more of them than they feel capable of giving. So they minimize, they downplay the depth. They reframe the situation as casual, confusing, or temporary. Sometimes they even rewrite history, not to deceive you, but to soothe themselves. If it wasn't that serious, then the withdrawal doesn't need to be examined. If they weren't that invested, then the ending doesn't require grief. Silence becomes a tool for regulation, not responding, not explaining, not clarifying. All of it serves one purpose: keeping the emotional temperature low enough to function. But this strategy has a cost. At the time, silence feels like safety. It reduces anxiety. It restores a sense of control. They believe they've contained the damage, What they don't realize is that unspoken truth doesn't disappear. It accumulates. The regret arrives later when distance no longer provides relief. When they recognize that by protecting themselves in the moment, they sacrifice something that could have been integrated if they'd been willing to be honest. The realization is subtle but heavy. If I had said more, things might have unfolded differently. Silence may have shielded them temporarily, but it also erased the possibility of repair, understanding, or emotional completion. That's where the regret lives. Not in what they said, but in everything they never allowed you to know. Because now the truth exists only inside them with no place to go. And carrying it alone becomes far heavier than the vulnerability they were trying to avoid in the first place. Regret doesn't hit when they're alone. It hits when they feel calm again and you're still gone. Avoidants are often misunderstood, emotionally unaffected, but the truth is more precise. They function best under suppression. High emotional states, conflict, or even constant stimulation give their nervous system something to organize around. When a relationship ends, the initial withdrawal doesn't feel like loss, it feels like relief. The emotional intensity drops, the pressure lifts, they regain a sense of internal order. This is why regret doesn't show up in the aftermath. In those early stages, avoidance is working exactly as designed. They stay busy, stay distracted, stay regulated through distance. But this state is temporary. Eventually, life stabilizes. The chaos fades. There's no conflict to manage, no emotional spikes to suppress, no distraction strong enough to keep the body activated, and in that calm, something shifts. The nervous system finally has room to register what was actually happening. That's when regret locks in, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, as a recognition rather than a feeling. A subtle internal statement forms. That situation was bigger than I admitted. It wasn't just connection, it wasn't just timing, it wasn't just incompatibility. It was impact. And the reason this realization is so unsettling is because it arrives when they're stable again, when they should feel fine, when nothing is technically wrong. Yet something feels unresolved. The regret doesn't manifest as missing you in the way people expect. Avoidants rarely experience romantic longing in a traditional sense. What they feel instead is a sense of absence within themselves. A contrast between who they are now and who they briefly became in that connection. They don't regret losing access to you as a person. They regret losing access to the version of themselves that emerged around you. The one that felt more open, more emotionally alive, more seen without having to perform. That version didn't feel safe enough to stay, but it felt real enough to leave an imprint. And once it disappears, it can't be recreated on command. That's the part that lingers. They start noticing the difference in subsequent interactions. Conversations feel flatter, emotional exchanges feel controlled. The spark isn't missing, the depth, and that comparison happens involuntarily. It's not nostalgia, it's calibration. Their system remembers a higher level of emotional aliveness and recognizes its absence. This is the moment regret solidifies. Because now they understand that what they lost wasn't external, it was internal. They didn't just walk away from a relationship. They walked away from a version of themselves they don't know how to access anymore. And that realization arrives too late to change anything. The calm that once felt like safety now feels empty, not painful enough to reach out, not dramatic enough to disrupt their life, but persistent enough to stay. That's how avoidant regret works. It doesn't scream, it settles. And once it does, it becomes part of the emotional landscape they quietly carry forward, long after you're gone. Admitting regret would mean admitting they were never as detached as they pretended. Avoidants don't struggle with having feelings. They struggle with what those feelings mean. For them, emotion isn't just an internal experience, it's a verdict on their identity. Regret is especially threatening because it carries implications they've spent a lifetime resisting. If they admit regret, they admit vulnerability. If they admit vulnerability, they admit dependence. And if they admit dependence, the entire narrative of self-sufficiency they've built begins to fracture. This is why even when regret is present, it rarely becomes visible. Saying it out loud would force them to acknowledge that distancing didn't protect them the way they believed it would. It would mean accepting that avoidance isn't neutrality. It's a strategy with consequences. And that realization destabilizes the emotional armor they rely on to feel safe in the world. So instead of confession, they choose silence. Silence allows them to keep the story intact, that they were fine, unaffected, untouched. Instead of accountability, they choose narrative control. They frame the ending as mutual, inevitable, or necessary. They intellectualize what was emotional. They reduce what was meaningful into something manageable. This isn't about lying to you, it's about maintaining coherence within themselves. Because once they say, I regret how that ended, they also have to confront the uncomfortable truth that they weren't as emotionally distant as they believed, that the detachment was performative, not absolute, that something reached them in a way they couldn't contain, and that truth feels dangerous. Regret also introduces the possibility of responsibility. If they admit regret, they implicitly admit that a different outcome was possible, that their withdrawal played a role, that their silence mattered, that their emotional absence had weight for an avoidant nervous system. Responsibility equals exposure. Exposure equals risk. So the system shuts it down. They compartmentalize the regret instead. It stays internal, unspoken, unresolved, locked behind composure and restraint. On the surface, they appear calm, grounded, moved on. Underneath, the regret exists as tension rather than emotion. A tightening when they think about it too long, a discomfort when something reminds them of you, a subtle resistance to situations that feel emotionally similar. This is how they live with it, not by processing it, but by containing it. The tragedy is that containment feels safer than healing. Healing would require vulnerability. Vulnerability would require acknowledging loss. And acknowledging loss would require admitting they cared more than they were willing to show. So they carry the regret forward without ever naming it. Not because it isn't real, but because naming it would collapse the identity they've relied on to survive. And that's the paradox of avoidant regret. It's deeply felt, carefully hidden, and almost never confessed. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it matters too much. They don't regret the ending. They regret that you saw through them without ever knowing the full truth. What truly unsettles an avoidant isn't that you left or that the relationship ended. The loss for them can be rationalized. Endings can be reframed. Distance can be justified. What lingers instead is the exposure they couldn't fully prevent, the possibility that you sensed more than they ever admitted, that you felt the emotional depth beneath the restraint, the attachment beneath the composure, the intensity beneath the silence. They wanted to be the one who stayed controlled, unaffected, untouched by the situation. They wanted the ending to preserve the illusion that they were emotionally self-contained, that nothing reached them deeply enough to disrupt their equilibrium. But internally, the regret isn't about the outcome. It's about visibility, the quiet fear that you walked away with a clearer understanding of them than they were comfortable allowing, that you recognize the emotional pull, even when they refuse to name it. This is why the regret is tied so closely to exposure. Avoidants are less afraid of loss than they are of being seen. Being seen means being known. Being known means being accountable. And accountability threatens the emotional distance they rely on to feel safe. The haunting thought isn't, I wish you had stayed. It's, you saw something real and I never corrected it. They worry that you left not because you misunderstood them, but because you understood them too well, without ever being given the full truth. That creates a unique kind of discomfort because now they can't rewrite the narrative without confronting the part of themselves they tried to hide. Reaching out with honesty would mean admitting regret. Admitting regret would mean confirming that you matter. And confirming that would collapse the carefully maintained imbalance where they appeared less invested, less affected, less vulnerable. So they stay quiet. Not because they don't care, but because silence allows them to preserve ambiguity. As long as nothing is said, the emotional truth remains unverified. As long as they don't confess, they can maintain the illusion that the connection didn't reach them as deeply as it did. But internally, the regret persists as a tension between what was felt and what was shown. They replay moments where they almost opened up, almost admitted something, almost stayed present, and then pulled back. And what stings isn't the missed future. It's the missed honesty. The realization that you walked away without ever knowing how much the situation disrupted them, challenged them, and exposed their emotional limits. That's the part they hope you never realize. Because if you did, it would flip the entire story. It would mean the ending wasn't about disinterest or detachment, it was about fear. And that truth is far harder for an avoidant to sit with than silence ever was. If they regret it, why don't they say anything? Because distance is the only language regret feels safe using. Avoidants don't move toward regret, they freeze around it. When the emotional weight of the situation finally settles into their system, their instinct is not repair, clarification, or emotional honesty. Their instinct is containment. Regret, an avoidant, feels destabilizing. It threatens to reopen emotional territory they barely escaped intact. Apologies require emotional presence. Presence requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires staying in the discomfort long enough to be seen, and that sequence feels unsafe to their nervous system. So instead of reaching out, they retreat further inward. They become quieter, more neutral, more self-contained. From the outside, this looks like indifference or emotional coldness. But internally, it's an effort to keep the emotional system from spiraling. Distance becomes a regulator. Silence becomes a boundary. They convince themselves that not engaging is the mature, respectful, or rational choice. But what they're actually doing is preventing emotional reactivation. Because if they apologize, they have to feel. If they feel, they risk losing control. And control is the one thing their attachment strategy is built around. So regret doesn't translate into words, it translates into restraint. They pull back not because they don't care, but because caring feels unmanageable. Every unsent message, every avoided conversation, every delayed response is a form of self-soothing. It's the nervous system saying, don't touch this, you don't know how to survive it if you do. This is why avoidant regret is so often misunderstood. People expect remorse to look like action. For avoidance, remorse looks like containment. The absence of contact isn't the absence of feeling, it's the attempt to keep feeling from overflowing. They tell themselves that time will dull it, that space will neutralize it, that distance will make it disappear. But what distance actually does is keep the regret unexpressed, unresolved, and quietly reinforced. Because every time they choose silence over vulnerability, the regret deepens, not loudly, but structurally. It becomes embedded in the way they relate, withdraw, and protect themselves going forward. They don't miss you the way you imagine. They replay moments they wish they'd handled differently. Avoidant regret is rarely romantic. It doesn't show up as yearning, fantasy, or emotional longing. It shows up as analysis, as mental replay, as quiet self-critique they would never admit to anyone else. They revisit specific moments, not the entire relationship, but fragments. The conversation where they shut down too quickly. The moment they minimized something that mattered. The point where they chose distance instead of curiosity. These replays aren't emotional reliving, they're cognitive valuations. Their mind treats the connection like a case study they're trying to close properly after the fact. What did I misjudge? Where did I exit too early? What signal did I ignore? This is how avoidants process regret. Intellectually, not emotional, feeling-based processing would require vulnerability. Cognitive processing allows distance, but even this analytical replay carries weight. Because each review reinforces a realization they didn't want to reach. I didn't fully understand what I was walking away from. The regret isn't about losing love, it's about abandoning something before they had the emotional clarity to assess it accurately. They recognize, often too late, that they left during activation, not insight, during defense, not truth. And that realization is unsettling because it undermines their belief that withdrawal equals wisdom. They begin to see that their exit strategy may have been premature, protective, and incomplete. But instead of turning that awareness into communication, they keep it internal. They close the file without sharing the findings. The replays continue quietly, especially when something in their present life echoes the past. A similar dynamic, a familiar emotional pull, and suddenly the unfinished business resurfaces, not as desire, but as recognition. That's the private reality of avoidant regret. Not dramatic, not expressive, but persistent. a loop of moments they wish they'd stayed present long enough to understand and now never can. They're not waiting for you to come back. They're waiting for the feeling to disappear. Avoidants are time-dependent processors. They've learned, often early in life, that emotional intensity fades if it's left alone long enough. Time becomes their primary coping strategy. Distance plus distraction plus time has worked before, so they trust it will work again. When a connection ends, they don't expect to process what happened. They expect it to dissolve. They assume the weight of the situation will soften, then disappear entirely. That belief allows them to move forward without looking back. But regret disrupts that system, because when weeks turn into months and the emotional imprint remains, something doesn't add up. The feeling doesn't escalate, but it doesn't vanish either. It lingers in the background, quiet, persistent, and inconvenient. This is deeply unsettling for an avoidant because it challenges the core assumption that avoidance neutralizes impact. The realization forms slowly. This wasn't temporary, not the connection, not the effect, not what it activated, and that conclusion creates a subtle but constant distress. It's not enough to reach out, not enough to confess, not enough to change behavior, but enough to remain present, enough to resurface during moments of stillness, enough to influence future connection. They keep waiting for the feeling to fade, and when it doesn't, they don't confront it. They wait longer. Time becomes a holding pattern rather than a solution, and in that waiting, the regret settles into something permanent, not loud, not dramatic, but unresolved. A reminder that some emotional experiences can't be outweighed, only understood, and understanding is the one thing they were trying to avoid. Regret threatens the story they tell themselves about who they are. Most avoidants don't just prefer independence, they organize their identity around it. Emotional self-sufficiency isn't a trait, it's a self-concept. They see themselves as people who don't need much, don't rely deeply, don't get emotionally entangled. Regret directly challenges that image, because if they regret how things ended, it means the connection mattered more than they admitted. It means they needed something they never named. It means detachment wasn't strength, it was defense, and that realization creates an internal conflict they don't know how to resolve. Accepting regret would require updating their identity. It would require acknowledging emotional limits, attachment needs, and vulnerability. So instead of integrating the lesson, many avoidants compartmentalize it. The regret gets placed in a separate mental category, something that happened but doesn't define them, something they think about but don't absorb. This allows them to preserve their self-image while still carrying the emotional residue. But compartmentalization isn't resolution, it's delay. The regret doesn't disappear, it waits, and it often resurfaces later when another connection triggers the same dynamic, a similar closeness, a familiar pull, a moment where withdrawal feels tempting again. That's when the unresolved pattern reactivates. They feel the tension between who they believe they are and what they keep experiencing, independence versus attachment, control versus connection. And instead of seeing the pattern clearly, they often repeat it, not because they haven't learned, but because learning would require redefining themselves. That's the quiet damage of avoidant regret. It doesn't just affect one relationship. It destabilizes identity. Until that conflict is addressed, the same ending keeps happening with different people, but the same internal outcome. They don't want you to know the regret exists, because it would change the power dynamic forever. Avoidants are masters of control through distance, and much of that control depends on the illusion that they remain less invested, less affected, less vulnerable than the other person. If you were to know how deeply the situation affected them, the entire emotional narrative would flip. Suddenly, you'd no longer be the one assumed to care more. Suddenly, you'd no longer question your impact. You'd know undeniably that you mattered more than they were willing to admit. That knowledge threatens their carefully maintained balance. Avoidants protect that imbalance because it preserves psychological leverage, allowing them to operate without feeling fully exposed. The regret isn't hidden to punish you, it's hidden to defend themselves. To let it be known would be to surrender control over their inner world, to let the emotional truth destabilize the system they rely on to stay safe. They carry it quietly, like a weight they cannot share, because sharing it would confirm vulnerable exposure and a level of emotional risk they have spent a lifetime learning to avoid. By keeping this truth invisible, they maintain the illusion of neutrality while internally navigating a storm they can't afford to acknowledge openly. You become unknowingly powerful in their system simply by remaining unaware. The knowledge of your significance would make you emotionally dangerous, capable of shifting the equilibrium they rely on to feel secure. So instead, they contain, compartmentalize, and distance, preserving both the secret and their identity as someone untouched by what they actually feel. Avoidant regret doesn't heal. It goes dormant until something wakes it up. Avoidants rarely process emotional experiences in real time. Instead, they push them away, distract, and compartmentalize, believing that time alone will diminish impact. But unprocessed emotional experiences don't vanish. They lie dormant, quietly embedded in the nervous system, waiting for a trigger. Often that trigger is a new relationship. When they encounter a similar dynamic, feel the same pull, or recognize a familiar emotional pattern, the old regret resurfaces with astonishing clarity. It doesn't come as longing or nostalgia, it comes as comparison. Suddenly, they see the gap between what they allowed themselves to feel in the past and what they are now repeating. The behaviors they thought were neutral, withdrawing, limiting intimacy, emotional shielding, are mirrored again, forcing recognition of the lessons they never fully absorbed. That resurfacing is rarely flattering. The comparison exposes patterns of avoidance, missed opportunities, and emotional limitations. It highlights the ways they failed to engage with what mattered when it mattered. Avoidant regret, therefore, functions like a ghost in the background, invisible, dormant, but persistent. It reappears under the right circumstances, unbidden, reminding them that avoidance doesn't erase impact. It merely delays reckoning. And unlike traditional guilt or remorse, this regret rarely prompts apologies or reconnection. It quietly influences behavior, shaping interactions and internal narratives, often unnoticed by those around them. Dormant, yet powerful, it lingers until either confrontation, insight, or repetition forces acknowledgement. It is a silent, ongoing shadow of the connection they never fully integrated, a testament to the emotional depth they denied at the time. They don't regret losing you, they regret not being able to show up when it mattered. At its deepest level, avoidant regret isn't about you at all. It's about capacity, the painful recognition that they weren't emotionally equipped to handle something real when it arrived. And that realization tends to arrive only after the opportunity has closed. That's the part they never wanted you to know, because it confirms that the ending wasn't about incompatibility. It was about limitation.